The Russian forces continued offensive operations all throughout Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad, the northern and western flanks of these cities. The Russians expanded offensive operations to the north of Myrnohrad, storming the apartment complex area in the northern outskirts, reaching the apartment complex area in the central parts and storming the first buildings there as well, in addition to offensive operations northwest of Sukhiyar. To the northwest of Pokrovsk itself, the Russians are reaching the outskirts of Hryshyne and are storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the E50 highway and railway in the northwest. The Russians also managed to capture an additional fortified position here to the west of Pokrovsk. These are some of the many developments throughout the past 24 hours. Starting out to the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control of the fortified positions here to the west of the city, advancing alongside the roads up towards the next fortified positions, and fighting is taking place along the fortifications along the railway connecting to the Dnipropetrovsk region and the city of Dnipro. The Russians are continuing these offensive operations to the southern outskirts of Hryshyne as well, where Deep State Map reports the southern parts of the town in the gray zone, which means Russians have started storming the southern parts of it from the southeast along the Pokrovsk direction from the industrial area, and from the south as well, where fighting is taking place over the fortifications to the south of Hryshyne, which will enable for a second route into the town. So the Russians are storming the fortifications just outside of Hryshyne along the E50 highway and the railway, and the southern parts of Hryshyne. Gaining a foothold within the town will allow the Russians to start storming the bastion of the logistics that are going into the outskirts of Pokrovsk. This means a push towards Hryshyne will strengthen the Russian offensive operations towards the outskirts of Pokrovsk in combination with their recent offensive operations on the northern flank as well. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over Pokrovsk, the fortified line to the north of the city, and to the north of Hryshyne in the direction of the town, to cut off the supply connection leading into the city of Myrnohrad in the east and Rodensky in the northeast. As for the Myrnohrad direction, the Russians started storming Sukhiyar from the west. Again, Deep State Map expanding their gray zone to include the fortified position northwest of Sukhiyar and the western residential area, as the Russians are storming the fortified positions to the west of the town, gain control over the flank leading into it, and force a Ukrainian withdrawal from the town through the roads the Russians would have fire control over by capturing the western residential area. So the Russians are here working their way up towards the southern outskirts of Myrnohrad, while at the same time the Russians have been detected in the eastern outskirts of the apartment complex area and the central parts of the city, in between the northern and southern section of it. This means the battle has begun over the central apartment complex area, which is central to the defense of the city, as the Russians will be able to isolate the northern and southern parts and connect their forces between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad through this area, as the apartment complex area is the main defensive position of the Ukrainians, overlooking the whole western flank of Myrnohrad. Capture of the apartment complex area allows Russians to gain full control over everything south of it, including the fortifications, the open fields, and the southern parts of the city, as well as an entryway into the northern parts of Myrnohrad from the south, in combination with the foothold gained in the eastern apartment complex area and eastern residential area of the city, and the new advances along the northern apartment complex area, where the Russians gain control over additional buildings and are slowly pushing through these apartment complex buildings to gain full control of the northern parts, gaining a bridgehead and foothold within the northern parts of the city, and advancing from the north, east, and south. To the north of this, the Ukrainians continued offensive operations on the western flank of Shchurove, where they are storming the supply line of the Russian forces leading into the western parts of Shchurove, including the fortified positions on the northern flank and the western residential area. The objective of the Ukrainians is to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces, encircle the Russian forces, and then storm them from the north and west, as well as from within the town itself, to regain control over the supply line leading into the town from the northwest, while at the same time they are fighting over the eastern road to regain control over Shchurove, that is completely cut off from any supply line except for some river crossings through the eastern residential area into the main parts of Shchurove, which is very difficult for the Ukrainians to do on any sort of scale other than simply resupplying the forces with drones. So practically Shchurove is encircled, although there is a tiny possibility that Ukrainians can still resupply through the roads, but for the drone capacity, it is still present, and it is not to be underestimated these days, as the Ukrainian forces within Myrnohrad can still be resupplied with drones, the same with the ones operating within Shchurove and Toretsk. As for the capacity of the Ukrainians to resupply all of these forces, with the loss of Pokrovsk, it is certainly limited, as the Ukrainians would be resupplying from Rivnopillya, Shevchenko, and Hryshyne as the main areas, as well as Pilitske here to the north of Rudinske, which limits the resupply capability because they have lost the city of Pokrovsk, and the needs of the Ukrainian forces is large. However, Shchurove itself is a much smaller area, and there's a lot more settlements in their control that allows them to properly resupply it. To the southwest of this, the Russians considered offensive operations, gaining control over both Rivnopillya and Yablukove. Although the Russian side has not announced these captures, the Ukrainian deep state map has, which means the Russians have now gained control of both Rivnopillya and Yablukove, which allows them to have a foothold for further offensive operations down along the fortifications. Now, an interesting point was raised by Deep State Map following the capture of both of these towns, and that is the fact that the Russians, with their stretched out supply lines, their main supply hub for their forces in the area is from Velika Novoselka through this very long road along the first line of defense to connect to the front line. Additional supply routes from the east through Myrnohrad and Poltavka is also now connected. However, this is not enough for a large enough force to deal with a small city such as Vuhledar. This means the stretched supply lines will not be enough for the Russian forces. They can threaten the supply lines here to the east by gaining control of the fortifications through Satishya and gain control over Veselis, Lenihai, and Vysoke, which will allow for an additional supply line. But yet again, the actual supply line from larger cities such as Donetsk and Mariupol are very limited. They would have to go through a long road before reaching the frontline positions, and these are all overstretched supply lines that cannot supply a large force due to Ukrainian long-range strikes from drones and MLRS strikes such as HIMARS. These limit the supplies in large numbers going to the frontline positions here in the area. This is why gaining control of Vuhledar is such a large task for the Russians. And the importance of it is also it being established as a supply hub for the Russian forces going forward, with several supply lines leading into it and stretching out from it. And based on that, Deep State Map says that the Russians do not have the necessary supplies to gather enough forces to take control over Vuhledar. That is potentially true. If the Russians cannot properly supply their forces at the front in a large enough scale to capture the city, then they'll be unable to do so. But gaining control of the fortifications down to Satishya and gaining control over the eastern road in combination with the roads leading up from the northeast will allow the Russians to gather more and more forces. The problem is they would have to drive through a long distance to reach the city, from which they'll be constantly struck by Ukrainian drones striking their positions. This raises the question, how will the Russians capture the city? Well, by reverting to old tactics, largely destroying all of the Ukrainian firing positions within the city. If they launch large strikes, MLRS, missiles, and so on, they'll be able to destroy most firing positions of the Ukrainians, and by combining that with a push with armored vehicles, they would be able to gain a foothold within the city, and having infantry move through the fortifications, gaining control over the eastern flank and southern flank, and combining it with a push from Myrnohrad will allow the Russians to have additional supply lines leading into the city, so it is certainly possible. If the Russians do not want to risk their forces during such an operation, then it is also possible that the Russians will be moving through the forest lines in between the Yancha River and the second line of defense to gain control over the roads leading up to Vuhledar from the north and bypassing the city from the northern flank. The objective would be to push through from the Delyvka along the second line of defense to the rear of it, gain control over the fortifications, and combine it with their pushes from the eastern direction through the forest lines in small infantry groups to slowly gain control over the entire area north of Vuhledar and threaten the supply lines leading in from the northwestern direction and strike the Ukrainian positions by focusing entirely on the second line of defense and bypassing Vuhledar, cutting off the supplies and gaining control of it by operationally encircling the city as they have done with Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. And on that scenario, it will take months before the Russians capture Vuhledar, not days or weeks, from a direct push, which will take a lot more casualties, but will be much more direct. Gaining control over Vuhledar and the highway all the way from Vuhledar up to Pokrovsk will significantly strengthen Russian offensive capabilities here on the eastern flank of the Zaporizhzhia region and southern flank of the Dnipropetrovsk region, but will also require a lot more forces. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Delyvka, advancing from the railway through towards the rear of Ivanopillia by cutting off the highway leading into the town from the north. With this, the supplies going to Ivanopillia is limited, and the Russians are strengthening the offensive operations to gain full control over the town, which will then have 2 additional supply routes leading into Delyvka from the south, strengthening the offensive operations by the Russians in the area. To the north of this, the Russians continue offensive operations north of Chasiv Yar, gaining control over additional forest lines and forest patches west of the canal, and to the north of Myrnohrad, gaining control over additional fortifications of the canal itself. The Russians are here developing offensive operations through the canal towards Myrnohrad and the northern flank towards Delyvka. The objective is to bypass the fortifications of the Ukrainians by gaining control over the ones along the canal and then flanking the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians are able to man most of the fortifications along the front line itself. However, if the front line is extended, they'll have to man more fortifications, and with the limited manpower, it is difficult to man all of them, which again means that the Russians can outflank the Ukrainians if they maneuver well enough. And that is their attempt here along the canal. Finally, the Russians continued offensive operations within Yablukove, gaining control of additional parts of the northern section, and the Ukrainians continued their counterattacks from the south, where they managed to regain control over the southern and central parts of the town, while the central parts here in between the Russian and Ukrainian positions is a death zone where neither the Russian or Ukrainian forces can properly operate, as either side going into the central parts is heavily struck by artillery and drones, which limits their maneuverability and ability to push through to gain control of a larger part of the town. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.